Part 1: The Shattered Vows. When Daniel and I got married, the world seemed to pause for us. The ceremony was picture perfect. Roses lining the aisle, a soft breeze whispering through the trees, and the kind of vows that left every guest teary-eyed. Daniel held my hand so tightly as he promised to love, honor, and cherish me. In that moment, I truly believed we had everything we needed to face whatever life threw at us. Our honeymoon was a dream, too. We wandered hand in hand through cobblestone streets in Europe, tasting gelato under the stars and laughing about nothing and everything. I thought, this is it. This is the kind of love people write stories about. But reality came knocking not long after. Married life wasn't quite what I'd imagined. Daniel started staying later at work, brushing off my concerns with a distracted kiss on the forehead. "I'm just busy," he'd say, barely looking up from his phone. First, I believed him. After all, marriage is supposed to be about trust, right? The first rail crack appeared 3 months in. I remember finding a receipt for a dinner I didn't attend. "Oh, that? Just a client meeting," he explained, flashing that same charming smile he always used to get out of trouble. I wanted to believe him so badly. Then there were the hushed phone calls he'd take in another room, his voice dipping into a tone I hadn't heard before. And the cologne. He started wearing it every day, something he hadn't done in years. When I teased him about it, he laughed nervously and said, "Can't a guy want to smell good for his wife?" But it wasn't for me. I could feel it in my bones. One evening I confronted him. I had spent the day obsessively going through every little sign, every offhand comment, every time he'd pulled away. "Daniel, is there someone else?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't deny it. He just sat there, staring at the floor like a kid caught sneaking out past curfew. "I didn't want you to find out like this," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Find out what?" I pressed, though I already knew. "I met someone," he admitted, his eyes still refusing to meet mine. "And I think I'm in love with her." The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. My breath caught, my ears rang, and for a moment, I thought I might actually pass out. How could he say that? After everything we'd built, everything we promised each other? "You think you're in love with her?" I spat, anger bubbling up through my shock. "What about me, Daniel? What about us? Did none of that mean anything to you?" He finally looked up, and the pity in his eyes was almost worse than his words. "I didn't mean for this to happen. But I can't lie to you or to myself. It's not fair to either of us." Not fair. The irony of that statement was laughable. He had torn apart our marriage, shattered my trust, and now he was talking about fairness? By the time he said the word divorce, I was too numb to react. He might as well have said he was going to the grocery store. My mind spun as I tried to process the end of something I thought would last forever. Later that night, after he'd gone to sleep in the guest room, I sat alone in our living room, surrounded by wedding photos and half-burned candles from our honeymoon. I stared at my wedding ring, twisting it around my finger until it felt like it was cutting into my skin. This wasn't just betrayal. It was the death of a dream. And the worst part was, I wasn't sure if I'd ever wake up from the nightmare. Part 2. Picking up the pieces. The day after Daniel dropped the divorce bombshell, I woke up to an empty house. He'd left early, his side of the bed neatly made as if he hadn't slept there at all. For a moment, I thought maybe it was a bad dream. But the papers he'd left on the kitchen counter, preliminary divorce forms, complete with a sticky note that read, "Let me know when you're ready to talk," quickly shattered that illusion. I spent the next few days in a fog. My phone buzzed incessantly with messages from friends and family who somehow already knew. Gossip travels fast, and Daniel hadn't wasted any time moving on with his mistress. People were so sorry and couldn't believe it. But their pity only made me feel smaller, more fragile. I stopped answering their calls. Instead, I sank into the couch, still wearing the pajamas I'd slept in, clutching a blanket like it was a shield against the world. I let the TV drone on in the background, not really watching but needing the noise to fill the silence. Every once in a while, I'd glance at the wedding album on the coffee table, taunting me with its glossy lies. One particularly dark evening, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at my reflection. My face was puffy from crying, my hair a tangled mess. I hardly recognized myself. Who am I without him? I whispered to no one, the words hanging in the air like a challenge. It wasn't until my best friend, Clara, showed up unannounced that I finally left the couch. She let herself in with the spare key I'd given her years ago, armed with takeout and a bottle of wine. "Oh no," she said, taking one look at me. This won't do. She marched over, yanked the blanket away, and shoved the food into my hands. Eat. Now. I tried to protest, but Clara wasn't having it. You're not going to let that cheating piece of garbage win by turning into a human puddle, she declared, pulling me up and dragging me to the shower. And for God's sake, wash your hair. It's starting to look like a bird's nest. As I stood under the hot spray, something shifted. The warmth melted away a sliver of the cold that had settled in my chest. By the time I emerged, wrapped in a fresh towel, Clara had laid out an outfit and poured me a generous glass of wine. I'm not saying you have to have it all figured out right now, she said as we sat on the couch together, sipping wine and eating greasy noodles. But you're stronger than this and you deserve better. Her words stuck with me long after she left. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized that she was right. I had spent so much time trying to hold on to a man who didn't want me that I'd forgotten about the one person who should have always been my priority. Myself. The next morning I made a list. It was simple, just a few things to get me through the day. Get out of bed before noon. Shower and dress like a functional adult. Call a lawyer. Throw out everything that reminds me of Daniel. The list gave me a sense of purpose, however small. Step by step, I started to reclaim my life. I boxed up our wedding photos and shoved them into the back of the closet. I swapped out the fancy bed sheets he picked for a cheap set I bought online, just because they were bright and cheery. And I stopped wearing my wedding ring, though it felt like cutting off a part of myself. But the hardest part was the lawyer. Sitting in her office, recounting the details of our short-lived marriage and Daniel's betrayal, felt like tearing open a wound that had barely started to heal. She was kind but firm, assuring me that I had rights and options. He doesn't get to dictate the terms, she said, sliding a stack of papers across the desk. This is your life too. That night I sat at my kitchen table with a pen in hand, staring at the blank spaces on the divorce forms. I didn't sign them. Not yet. Instead, I wrote something else, a name. Ethan. I hadn't thought about him in years, but now his name glowed on the page like a beacon. Ethan had been my rock once, back when life was simpler. Could he be again? The thought both terrified and thrilled me. I folded the paper and tucked it into a drawer. I wasn't ready to make any decisions just yet, but for the first time in weeks, I felt something other than pain. I felt hope. Part 3, recalling an old flame. I didn't intend to think about Ethan that night, or any night for that matter. His name had been buried in a corner of my mind I hadn't visited in years, locked away along with the wistful what-ifs I had once entertained. But as I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty divorce papers, his name came unbidden, a flicker of light in the darkness. Ethan and I had been inseparable in college, the kind of friendship that teetered on the edge of something more. He was my confidant, my partner in crime, the one person who could always make me laugh, even during finals week when stress turned everyone else into zombies. He had a way of looking at me like I was the only person in the room, and for a while I thought maybe he was my forever. But life had a funny way of throwing curveballs. Ethan had been offered a prestigious job overseas right after graduation. I encouraged him to go, even though it felt like ripping out a piece of my heart. You're going to do amazing things, I told him, forcing a smile. And he had. At least, that's what I imagined from the sporadic social media posts and the occasional email we exchanged in the early years. Somewhere along the line, our messages became fewer and farther between. I started dating Daniel, and Ethan became a bittersweet memory. Until now. I couldn't shake the thought of him, so the next day, I found myself scrolling through old photos on my laptop. There he was, grinning with his arms slung over my shoulder at some long-forgotten party. His eyes sparkled with mischief, and I couldn't help but smile, even as tears pricked the corners of my eyes. I debated reaching out to him for days. What if he didn't remember me the same way? What if he'd moved on, married someone, built a life I had no place in? But something in me, call it desperation, hope, or sheer curiosity, pushed me forward. I started small, digging up his last email address from years ago and typing out a message. Hey Ethan, I know it's been a long time, but I was thinking about you today and wondering how you're doing. No pressure to respond, but I'd love to catch up if you're open to it. I hit send before I could overthink it and immediately regretted it. What if he thought it was weird? Or worse, what if the email bounced back because he'd changed his address? For 2 agonizing days I checked my inbox obsessively. Nothing. By the 3rd day I convinced myself I'd made a mistake and tried to put it out of my mind. But just as I was about to shut my laptop, a notification popped up. His reply was short and sweet. Hey, I can't believe it's you. I've thought about you so many times over the years. Are you free to catch up soon? My heart raced as I read and reread the message. He had thought about me. He wanted to catch up. It felt like a lifeline, and I wasn't about to let it slip away. We arranged to meet in person a week later, halfway between our cities at a cozy little cafe I'd never been to before. The drive felt endless, my nerves growing with every mile. What would he think of me now? Would he notice the faint shadows under my eyes or the way my smile didn't quite reach my eyes anymore? When I walked through the door, there he was, sitting at a corner table with a cup of coffee in front of him. Time had changed him, sure. His hair was a little shorter, his frame a little leaner, but his smile was the same, warm and inviting. "You came," he said, standing to hug me. The embrace felt familiar, comforting, like slipping into a favorite sweater on a chilly day. We talked for hours, reminiscing about the past and filling in the gaps of the years we'd missed. He told me about his career, his travels, and the small city he'd moved to after returning to the States. I told him about my marriage, glossing over the worst parts, and my recent decision to leave it behind. "I'm sorry you went through that," he said, his expression soft with empathy. "You deserve so much better." His words hit me harder than I expected, and for a moment, I felt like the tears might start again. But instead I smiled. "Thank you," I said. "I'm starting to believe that." By the time we parted, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the street. As I drove home, I realized something unexpected. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't alone. Part 4, Reconnection. The drive to see Ethan for the second time was far less nerve-wracking than the first. After that long afternoon at the cafe, something in me had shifted. It wasn't just the comfort of being around someone who knew me before my life got tangled in heartbreak. It was the way he listened, genuinely cared, and didn't judge me for the mess I had become. Still, as I pulled up to his house, a charming brick home nestled on a quiet tree-lined street, I couldn't help but feel a flutter of nerves. What if this visit changed things? What if the familiarity we had rediscovered in the cafe didn't hold up under the weight of reality? Ethan greeted me at the door with that same warm smile, and I was instantly at ease. He wore a simple sweater and jeans, his hair slightly mussed like he'd been running his hands through it all morning. "You're right on time," he said, stepping aside to let me in. The inside of his house felt just like him, cozy and inviting. Books lined the shelves and a faint scent of coffee lingered in the air. A dog trotted over to me, wagging its tail enthusiastically. "This is Max," Ethan said, crouching down to ruffle the dog's fur. "He's the real boss around here." I laughed, scratching Max behind the ears. "He's adorable." Ethan led me to the living room, where a fire crackled softly in the hearth. He'd set out a tray with tea and cookies, the kind of small, thoughtful gesture that made my chest ache with gratitude. "So," he said, settling into the armchair across from me, "how have you been holding up?" It was such a simple question, but the way he asked it with genuine concern made my throat tighten. "Better," I admitted. "It's still hard, but I'm starting to feel like myself again." He nodded, his gaze steady. "That's good. You deserve to feel like yourself." We spent the afternoon talking, sharing more about the years we'd been apart. Ethan told me about his time overseas, the challenges he faced building a life in a foreign country, and how much he missed home. "But I never regretted going," he said. "It taught me so much about who I am and what I want." I told him about my career, the ups and downs, and how I'd put so much of myself into supporting Daniel that I'd nearly lost sight of my own goals. "I used to love writing," I said, surprising myself with the admission. "But somewhere along the way I stopped." "You should start again," Ethan said without hesitation. "You always had such a way with words." His confidence in me felt like a balm, soothing wounds I hadn't realized were still raw. At some point the conversation shifted to lighter topics. Funny college memories, embarrassing moments, and the kind of easy banter that felt like slipping into an old favorite pair of shoes. He even pulled out his guitar, something I hadn't seen him play since our college days. "Do you still remember Yellow by Coldplay?" I teased as he strummed a few chords. He grinned. "How could I forget? It was your favorite song." He started playing, his fingers moving effortlessly over the strings, and I couldn't help but sing along. By the end of the song we were both laughing, the sound filling the room like sunlight breaking through the clouds. As the evening wore on, Ethan cooked dinner. A simple pasta dish that tasted better than anything I'd had in months, and we ate at the kitchen counter talking about everything and nothing. "I've missed this," I admitted, swirling my fork through the last of the sauce. I've missed you. Ethan looked at me, his expression serious. I've missed you too. More than I realized. The air between us shifted, heavy with unspoken feelings. For a moment I thought he might say more, but instead he reached out and covered my hand with his. You've been through so much, he said softly. And I don't want to rush anything. But I hope you know I'm here. For whatever you need. His words settled over me like a warm blanket. For so long I'd felt alone, like I was fighting an uphill battle with no one in my corner. But now, sitting here with Ethan, I felt something I hadn't in months: hope. When I finally left that night, the stars were bright against the inky sky, and my heart felt lighter than it had in ages. As I drove home, I found myself smiling, humming the tune of Yellow under my breath. Maybe, just maybe, life was starting to look brighter again. Part 5. Healing and Hope. The weeks that followed my visit to Ethan's were like stepping into a different chapter of my life. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't drowning in the wreckage of my marriage. Instead, I was swimming toward something new. Something that felt warm, kind, and safe. Ethan and I started talking more frequently. It began with casual text. Hey, I saw this and thought of you. Do you remember that time in college when? Any chance you'd like to grab coffee this weekend? Those small exchanges quickly turned into long conversations, and before I knew it, we were spending most of our free time together. He was a steady presence, gently nudging me to find joy in the little things again. One Saturday, we decided to go for a hike. Ethan said he knew a spot that wasn't too far from the city, but felt like stepping into another world. I wasn't much of an outdoorsy person, but I trusted him. The trail was tucked away in a quiet forest, the kind of place where sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled patterns on the ground. The air smelled fresh and earthy, and the sound of birdsong was punctuated by the crunch of leaves underfoot. You okay back there? Ethan called over his shoulder, grinning. Barely. I huffed, trying to catch my breath. You didn't tell me this was an uphill hike. He laughed, waiting for me to catch up. Trust me, it's worth it. When we finally reached the summit, I understood what he meant. The view was breathtaking. A sweeping panorama of rolling hills, dotted with wildflowers and framed by a sky so blue it looked almost unreal. We sat on a large rock, sipping water and soaking in the beauty around us. This, Ethan said, gesturing to the scene before us, is what I miss when I was overseas. The simplicity of it. The quiet. I nodded, feeling the tension in my chest ease. It's amazing. I can't remember the last time I felt this peaceful. He turned to me, his expression serious. You deserve peace, you know. After everything you've been through. The words hit me in a way I wasn't prepared for, and I felt my throat tighten. It's hard to believe that sometimes, I admitted. But being here with you, it helps. Ethan reached over and took my hand, his grip firm yet gentle. You don't have to do it alone, he said quietly. Not anymore. That moment stayed with me long after we left the trail. It wasn't just the view or the fresh air. It was the way Ethan made me feel seen, valued, and understood. As our connection deepened, I found myself opening up about things I hadn't shared with anyone. I told him about the nights I spent crying myself to sleep, the shame I felt for staying in a marriage that had crumbled so quickly, and the doubts that still haunted me. Ethan listened without judgment, his presence a constant source of comfort. He never tried to fix me or push me to move faster than I was ready for. Instead, he reminded me of my strength, encouraging me to take each day as it came. One evening, as we sat in his living room with Max curled up at our feet, I told him about my writing. I used to love it, I said, twisting my hands nervously, but I haven't done it in years. I don't even know where to start. Ethan smiled, leaning back on the couch. Start small, he said. Write about anything, a memory, a feeling, even Max's obsession with stealing socks. I laughed, the idea sparking something inside me. That night, I pulled out an old notebook and began to write. It was messy and imperfect, but it felt like coming home to a part of myself I'd forgotten. Slowly but surely, I began to heal. I started going to therapy, journaling, and even reconnecting with a few close friends. And through it all, Ethan was there, quietly supporting me every step of the way. One evening, as we stood in his kitchen cooking dinner together, I looked over at him and realized something that took my breath away. For the first time since my world had fallen apart, I felt hopeful, not just for the future, but for the possibility of love again. Part 6. A New Beginning. It wasn't love at first sight, at least not in the storybook sense. My journey with Ethan wasn't about rushing into something new. or filling the void Daniel left behind. It was slow, deliberate, and honest. And that's what made it real. A month after our hike, Ethan surprised me with a day trip to the lake. It was a crisp autumn morning, the kind that carried the faint scent of wood smoke and leaves crunching underfoot. The lake shimmered under the sun, its surface dotted with kayakers and the occasional brave swimmer. "Why are we here?" I asked as we stepped out of his car. Ethan grinned, reaching into the back seat to grab a picnic basket. "Because you've been working so hard on healing, and I thought you could use a day to just breathe." I smiled, my chest warming at the thoughtfulness of his gesture. "You're full of surprises, aren't you? Stick around and you might see a few more," he teased, leading me to a secluded spot by the water's edge. We spent the day talking, laughing, and watching the world go by. At one point, Ethan pulled out a sketchbook and started doodling. When I peeked over his shoulder, I saw a simple but beautiful drawing of the lake, complete with a tiny figure that looked suspiciously like me sitting on the shore. "Is that me?" I asked, touched. He shrugged, his cheeks flushing slightly. "Maybe. I just wanted to capture the moment." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Ethan grew quiet. He stared out at the water, his hands resting on his knees. "I need to tell you something," he said finally, his voice soft but steady. I tensed, the words sparking a flicker of uncertainty. "What is it?" He turned to face me, his eyes filled with a mixture of vulnerability and determination. "I know you're still healing and I don't want to rush you, but I also don't want to ignore how I feel." He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "You've always been important to me, even when we were apart. And now that you're here, now that we're here, I can't imagine my life without you in it." My heart pounded as I listened, his words filling the spaces inside me that had felt hollow for so long. "Ethan, I'm not asking for anything right now," he said quickly, his hands fumbling slightly as he spoke. "I just needed you to know. I'll wait as long as it takes because you're worth it." Tears welled in my eyes, but for the first time in months, they weren't from sadness. I reached out, covering his hand with mine. "You have no idea how much that means to me," I said, my voice trembling. We sat there in the fading light, the unspoken possibilities stretching out before us like the calm waters of the lake. For the first time I felt like I was standing on solid ground, not because someone else had pulled me up, but because I'd found my own strength again. As the stars began to twinkle overhead, I leaned my head against Ethan's shoulder. "I don't know what the future holds," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I'd like to find out. With you." His arm tightened around me, and I could feel his smile even without looking. That's all I could ever ask for. We stayed there long after the sun had set, wrapped in the warmth of each other's presence. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, but it was ours. And for the first time, I felt like I was writing a story I wanted to be part of. Have you ever reconnected with someone from your past and felt like life was giving you a second chance? If so, what happened? Or if not, do you believe in the idea of rekindling an old flame? Let's hear your stories. I'd love to know how others navigate love, loss, and the hope of starting again. Smiling face with smiling eyes,